Hey guys, Dave with the First Place Auto Parts. You know, when it comes time to either replacing or upgrading your air filter, you got some choices. One is a traditional paper, the other is an oil type, gauze type filter. And look, there's a lot of misconceptions about what these various filters do and what the benefits are to you and your car. Look, an air filter should do two things. One, keep the air clean, and two, not restrict the performance that you paid for when you bought your vehicle. And in today's video, what we're gonna do is we're gonna take a quick look at the two types of filters so you can make an informed decision on which one's right for your car, your budget, and your needs. So guys, for today we're talking air filters, so stay tuned. Now air filters, they come in three different flavors, and the first one's going to be the one that you're probably most familiar with, and that's the paper air filter. Look, this thing comes OEM on almost every vehicle made. The other filter, the second filter, is going to be your oil type, gauze type filter, most recognizable by the name K&N. Look, there's other manufacturers out there that do gauze type filters, but the K&N air filter is a perfect example. These things are made with gauze that you apply oil to, and they do a good job. They flow a lot of air. The third type of filter, and it's really not one that I recommend for your car, and this is from experience, but those are the foam air filters. And when we're talking about air filters, really there's three things that we have to measure their criteria by, and one is going to be the performance. How effective are they at not only filtering the air, but flowing air? The second thing is life expectancy, and that is how long do the filters last? And the third thing, well, that's ease of use. And by ease of use, I mean, do you have to clean it? One of these filters we do, the other we don't. We just simply pitch it. So those are going to be the criteria, and we're going to start with the paper air filter. Now the paper air filter from a performance standpoint is pretty good. Look, this thing will filter dirt particles down to a 10 micron size. Micron, guys, that's a scientific term for really small, and the reality is this thing does a really good job of filtering it down. Now, as far as the performance goes, paper air filters typically have several layers of paper in them, and they have a little bit of a restriction, but the reality is most of your OEMs do a really good job of sizing the air filter, like this 14-inch element I have here. This thing, even when it gets dirt on it or starts to become plugged, still flows enough air for an average small block at 5,000 RPMs at wide open throttle. Only when you substantially increase the performance of your vehicle do you need something that really flows more air. And the reality is, how many of us drive around wide open throttle all the time? A paper element air filter, it filters well, it offers good dependable performance, and they're relatively cheap. The beautiful thing about this thing is once it gets dirty, you take it out, you pitch it, and you buy a new one. New ones are relatively inexpensive, and look guys, you can find them at every auto parts store. But like I said earlier, if you've built a max performance car, maybe you want more airflow, and that is where the oil type gauze air filter comes in. I'm sure you've seen the display, the K&N display at all of your auto parts stores. They'll have a little ping pong ball floating in a tube with a paper filter and a gauze type filter over it, and when you put the paper filter over it, the ball drops because it can't flow enough air. And the reality is when you put the K&N filter, which is unoiled, over that little hole, the ball itself continues to float, showing you visually that yes, the unoiled gauze type air filter does flow more air than a standard paper filter. But you have to add oil to these gauze type air filters for them to actually filter air, and the oil does cause a restriction. There's several layers of gauze on this air filter, and depending on how much oil you put on it, it's either very, very good at filtering the dirt out of the air with a slight restriction, or if you put too much oil on one of these filters, and here's one of the knocks that people talk about with the gauze type oilable air filter, is you can get what's called oil migration. And look, this really has in particular of interest to the fuel injected guys that run mass airflow sensors that have the heated wire in them. Because what we had found back in the 90s and early 2000s was that people were over oiling their K&N type air filter. That oil was being sucked through and hitting on that heated wire and that mass airflow sensor, and it was starting to coat it. What happens when it coats it is it becomes less sensitive, and therefore there were drivability issues. The gauze type air filter, from a performance standpoint, is good. Look, it flows a lot of air, or has the potential to flow a lot of air, especially if you combine a top-mounted K&N air filter, which is traditionally chrome or metal, on top of a carbureted type air cleaner setup, combined with a full K&N round one. Some of you guys that have fuel injecting cars are going to have those pleated plates are those flat air filters, and no matter what you have, the K&N will flow air. Now we've all seen the ads of up to 40 more horsepower, and the reality is, look, the K&N could support more horsepower, but to get more horsepower, you've got to have more air demand. And if your car is stock or almost stock or just has some mild upgrades, even up to 100 horsepower, bump in horsepower over the stock, I would say that you'll never really realize a performance gain because the paper air filter isn't causing a restriction. So we get down to then with the gauze type air filter is cost. And look, these things cost anywhere from 2 to 3 to 4 times as much as a paper air filter. Now, the cost is embedded not only with the filter, but you have to buy the filter oil and the cleaner. So these K&N or these gauze type oilable air filters, they have costs associated with them that are much higher than the paper air filter. The performance, the potential is that it could be better only if your car needs it. So in regards to the gauze type versus paper, really right now the K&N is kind of peace of mind. In theory, it could offer you more performance than the paper air filter, but it also costs substantially more. The beauty of this thing and also the curse of the oilable type air filter is that they will last a long time because they are recleanable. Paper air filters, I know some people do it, they blow air through the inside out and try to do that, but what can happen with too much air pressure, especially if you're using some sort of an air compressor, you can actually rupture the fibers in these things and create not only pathways for dirt to get in, but also more restrictions. Don't try to clean your paper air filters. You can tap it out, but don't try to blow it out. But with this thing, you can clean it. Now look, cleaning it extends the life of the filter. Look, you can clean these things up in theory indefinitely, but really most manufacturers recommend roughly 3 to 4 times. After that, the fibers and the gauze start to become frayed and they just become less efficient at trapping dirt even with the oil. And when speaking of oil, when you oil these things, you have to use filter oil that are specifically meant for these things. The filter oil will have a carrier agent in it and it'll be colored so you can see when you've oiled the whole thing, and then it gets ultra tacky to trap that dirt. But look, these things do not over oil them, or they'll create a mess in your airbox and can create drivability issues on your fuel injected cars. So you got the cost of this thing is fairly high. Cleaning it is nice, but it's also a mess, and you have to be honest with yourself. These filters tend to filter better, believe it or not, when they're slightly dirty. But it's kind of a mess to do, and you have to buy a filter charger kit, which includes a cleaner and an oil. You've got to, after you clean it, you got to let it completely dry. Because if you don't, if you put oil on a wet gauze type air filter, the oil will actually dissipate and it won't effectively oil the whole thing. You'll get pockets where the oil didn't saturate. You don't want that because that means dirt could come through. So look guys, the decision is pretty straightforward. You know, if you want to spend a little bit or actually a lot more on a gauze oilable type air filter, feel free to do it. Your car probably will not pick up any horsepower or measurable horsepower at all. It will filter just as well or almost as well as a paper type air filter, and you can clean it. But you're going to come out of pocket 3, 4, 5 times as much by the time you buy the filter kit. And at that point, you really have to ask yourself, what have you gained? Look, they definitely have a different look to them. If you're going for an OEM look under your 69 Camaro or your 70 Chevelle, these paper filters are really the only thing that's going to look right. If you want something that you're going to keep the car for a long time, and you want something you can wash and not have to deal with the paper filters, buying them, the gauze type filter makes a lot of sense. And if you increase performance substantially, and which means airflow demand from your car for your car, then maybe a gauze filter makes sense. The old paper filters, guys, they work. They still work today. They're affordable and they're super easy to replace. The decision on which air filter you buy, of course, is completely up to you. But before you lay down your hard-earned cash, think hard and long about the oil filter. Are you going to keep the car long enough for it to pay itself back? Have you increased performance enough to need more airflow? And also, are you going to clean it with some sort of regularity every 25 to 30,000 miles? Again, depending on your driving. Guys, I hope this video was informational for you. And when it comes time to buying an air filter for your car, please check us out at First Place Auto Parts. There we have a ton of performance and restoration parts for your classic American muscle car, truck, and your late model vehicles. Until next time, keep the hammer down and keep it between the guardrails.